What if I told you that you never actually lost your motivation, you simply stopped listening to the part of yourself that still knows where you're meant to go? Maybe you're watching this video because something inside you has changed. There was a time when you felt driven to dream, start new projects, and imagine a different future. Now, even getting out of bed feels like an enormous effort. You tell yourself that tomorrow will be different. You make lists, set goals, watch videos about discipline, productivity, and habits, but a few days later, you're right back where you started. Then the guilt sets in. You begin to believe you've become lazy, weak, or incapable. After all, if so many people seem able to move forward, why do you feel trapped in the same cycle? But what if that explanation is completely wrong? We live in a culture that teaches us motivation is simply a matter of willpower. We're told that all we need is to want it more, work harder, and push ourselves further. Yet the more you try to force your mind to cooperate, the more it seems to resist. It's as if there's an invisible part of you pulling in the opposite direction. And this is exactly where most people make a mistake that can keep them stuck for years. They end up fighting a war against themselves without even realizing it. Carl Jung believed that the human mind is far deeper than we imagine. To him, what we call consciousness is only a small part of who we truly are. Beneath it lies an entire universe hidden within the unconscious, shaping our desires, our fears, our choices, and even the amount of energy we feel from day to day. And when that invisible part is no longer moving in the same direction as your conscious life, something remarkable happens. You don't just lose your enthusiasm. You lose your sense of meaning. And when meaning disappears, motivation disappears with it. Maybe that's why you still feel exhausted even after getting enough rest. Maybe that's why nothing excites you the way it once did. Not because there's something wrong with you, but because a silent conflict is unfolding within your own psyche, a conflict that almost no one notices, yet one that drains your energy every single day. What's most intriguing is that this process is usually interpreted in exactly the opposite way. You believe you need to find motivation in order to change your life, when, from Jung's perspective, it may actually be the life you're living that's suffocating your motivation. It may seem like a small difference in wording, but it completely changes the way you see yourself. And once you understand this mechanism, an unavoidable question arises: if the problem was never a lack of discipline, then where do these feelings of emptiness, stagnation, and lost energy, which seem to affect so many people today, really come from? That's exactly where the explanation begins, one that may completely transform the way you understand your own mind. Before we continue, I'd like to invite you to do something. If, at any point during these opening minutes, you felt as though someone had finally put into words what you've never been able to explain, take a moment to like this video. That simple gesture helps this message reach other people who are living through the same silent struggle and unfairly believe they've lost their inner strength. And I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever felt as though your motivation simply disappeared for no obvious reason? Or as if one part of you desperately wants to move forward while another part seems determined to hold you back? Leave the phrase, "I'm still searching for myself," in the comments, or describe, in your own words, what you've been experiencing. I read many of these comments, and you'll quickly realize you're not the only one going through this. Sometimes, simply discovering that others are facing the same inner conflict is the first step toward seeing your own reality in a new light. And if this is the kind of content that inspires you to think deeply about the human mind, the unconscious, Carl Jung's ideas, and the path of self-discovery, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Every week, we publish videos that go far beyond the usual advice about discipline and productivity. Our goal is to explore the invisible forces that shape who we are, why we suffer, and how we can reconnect with our true identity. Because throughout this video, you'll discover that what you now call a lack of motivation may simply be the most visible symptom of something far deeper. And understanding that difference could completely change the way you see your life, your choices, and, most importantly, the person you're becoming. There's a question very few people ever dare to ask themselves. What if you never actually lost your motivation? It sounds strange when everything inside you seems to say the exact opposite. After all, you look at your life and see abandoned projects, forgotten dreams, and goals that once filled you with excitement but now feel like nothing more than another burden on your shoulders. It's only natural to conclude that something inside you has died. But that conclusion may be the very first illusion keeping you trapped in this cycle. Before accepting that something in your mind is broken, it's worth noticing one small detail that almost everyone overlooks: you still have energy for certain things. Maybe you can spend hours worrying about a problem, endlessly scrolling through social media, imagining how different your life could be, or helping other people while struggling to help yourself. That means your energy hasn't disappeared. It has simply stopped fueling what once seemed important. That's an enormous difference. And this is where most explanations about personal development begin to fall apart. We're constantly told that what we need is more discipline, more focus, and greater productivity, as though the solution were simply pressing an internal switch and forcing ourselves to keep going. But you've probably already tried that. Maybe you've bought books, taken courses, created new routines, and promised yourself everything changes on Monday. Maybe you managed to stay consistent for a few days, only to watch that drive disappear again, leaving nothing behind but guilt and frustration. Then a dangerous thought appears. Maybe I'm the problem. Carl Jung viewed this kind of conflict in a completely different way. He famously said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." That idea isn't only about major life events. It also explains why so many people spend years believing they've lost the ability to take action, when in reality they're being guided by inner forces they've never learned to recognize. The unconscious doesn't speak through words. It speaks through energy. It reveals what still has meaning, and what no longer does. When there's harmony between who you are and the life you're living, your energy flows naturally. But when a silent conflict exists, the psyche itself begins withdrawing its emotional investment. Maybe that's why you can devote yourself wholeheartedly to things you don't even consider important, while the tasks that should move you closer to your dreams feel almost impossible to begin. It's not simply a lack of willpower. There's a conversation happening inside you that your conscious mind hasn't yet learned to hear. And the more you ignore that conversation, the more convinced you become that you need to fight against yourself. But fighting yourself is a battle no one wins. You may force your body to keep going for a while, but eventually the mind demands its price. First comes the constant exhaustion. Then procrastination. Then the feeling of emptiness. And finally, the belief that perhaps you'll never become the person you once were again. But there's another possibility. Maybe you're not losing who you used to be. Maybe you're letting go of someone you were never truly meant to be. That idea is uncomfortable because it challenges the identity we've spent our lives building. From an early age, we're taught to meet the expectations of our families, our schools, our workplaces, and society itself. We learn to seek approval, recognition, and belonging. Little by little, we shape our personalities in order to be accepted. The problem is that there comes a point when that carefully constructed version of ourselves begins to clash with who we truly are at our core. And when that happens, losing motivation may simply be the first sign that something deep within you is calling for a far more profound transformation. Jung believed that the psyche is always striving for balance. It cannot remain indefinitely separated from what it knows to be true. That's why, when we insist on following a path that no longer reflects who we really are, the psyche finds ways to make us stop. Sometimes it appears as an unexplained loss of motivation. Other times, it shows up as anxiety, a lingering sense of emptiness, or the feeling that no achievement is ever enough to fill what's missing. What's fascinating is that many people interpret these signs as flaws in their character, when they may actually be an invitation to look inward. Think back for a moment to the last time you truly felt alive. Not when you received praise or reached a goal, but when you had the feeling that you were exactly where you were meant to be. What was present in that moment that now seems to be missing? Was it really just motivation, or was it your connection to a much deeper part of your identity? That question may sound simple, but it opens a door that very few people have the courage to walk through, because it forces you to question not only what you do every day, but also why you keep doing it. If this reflection stirred something within you, write the phrase, "I'm ready to find myself again," in the comments. I want to know how many people have realized that perhaps the real battle was never against a lack of motivation, but against a life that no longer feels meaningful. If motivation doesn't disappear by accident, then we need to ask an even deeper question: what, exactly, is consuming all of your energy? Because the truth is that the human mind never stops investing energy somewhere. Even when you believe you can't bring yourself to do anything, your psyche is working constantly. It keeps generating thoughts, feeding worries, replaying memories, imagining the future, and trying to protect you from pain that may no longer even exist. The problem is that, instead of fueling your life, that energy ends up sustaining a silent inner conflict. And it was precisely this conflict that Carl Jung devoted much of his life to understanding. Jung believed that every human being wears a kind of mask in order to function in society. He called this mask the persona. The persona isn't inherently bad. It helps us coexist with others, work, build relationships, and find our place in the world. The problem begins when we spend so many years wearing that mask that we forget who actually exists behind it. Little by little, we stop acting because we genuinely want to and start acting because we believe we should. We choose careers to meet other people's expectations. We hide our emotions to appear strong. We silence our opinions to avoid rejection. We smile while we're falling apart inside. We pretend to be motivated when, in reality, all we want is to disappear for a few days. And the more perfect that mask appears to the world, the greater the distance usually becomes between the image we project and what we truly feel. It is within that gap that psychological exhaustion is born. Because maintaining an identity that no longer reflects who you are demands an enormous amount of psychic energy. Imagine trying to stay in character 24 hours a day, year after year. Eventually, your body grows tired. Your mind grows tired. And your soul does too. But there's an even deeper layer to this story. While the persona is trying to present an acceptable version of you to the world, another part of you is gradually being hidden, rejected, and pushed into the unconscious. Jung called this part the shadow. Contrary to what many people believe, the shadow isn't made up only of our flaws. It also contains talents we've never developed, desires we've been taught are wrong, abandoned dreams, repressed emotions, and aspects of our personality that we sacrificed in order to be accepted. In other words, the shadow also holds an enormous amount of life that was never allowed to exist. Perhaps, as a child, you were incredibly creative, curious, or sensitive. But after hearing over and over that you needed to be more serious, more rational, or more responsible, you gradually learned to hide those qualities. Maybe you wanted to follow a completely different path, but chose the one that seemed safer instead. Maybe you were taught that showing fear was a sign of weakness, that crying was something to be ashamed of, or that saying no would make people abandon you. Each of those small sacrifices seemed harmless at the time. But over the years, they accumulated into an invisible burden. That's why Jung said, "What you resist, persists." The more we try to push away important parts of our own personality, the more those parts find ways to get our attention. They don't always speak through words. More often, they show up as unexplained anxiety, chronic procrastination, a lingering sense of emptiness, irritability, discouragement, or that strange feeling that you're living a life that doesn't really feel like your own. What you interpret as a loss of motivation may actually be your psyche's desperate plea for you to stop ignoring who you truly are. And here's a detail that changes the entire perspective. Most people believe that regaining motivation means finding a better technique to become more productive. Jung would likely argue the opposite. Before searching for more energy, you need to discover where your energy is already going. Because no one can build a meaningful life while spending most of their strength hiding essential parts of their own identity. This silent struggle takes place every single day, without you even noticing. It begins the moment you wake up and once again put on the version of yourself you believe everyone else expects to see. Perhaps that's exactly why some people reach the end of the day feeling completely exhausted, even though they accomplished almost nothing that truly mattered to them. Their exhaustion doesn't come only from their tasks. It comes from the constant effort of maintaining an identity they can no longer sustain. And as long as that conflict remains invisible, every attempt to regain motivation will feel temporary, because the root of the problem remains untouched, hidden deep within the unconscious, waiting for the moment it is finally recognized. If this part of the video resonated with you, write the word mask in the comments. That single word may represent the moment you began to realize that your greatest source of exhaustion was never the outside world, but the distance between the person you appear to be and the person you truly are. Once you understand that so much of your energy may be consumed by the conflict between the persona and the shadow, an unavoidable question arises: if that invisible conflict is resolved, does motivation simply return? The answer is deeper than it first appears. Because there's an assumption that almost no one ever questions. We grow up believing that motivation comes first, then action, and finally transformation. But Carl Jung understood the psyche from an entirely different perspective. For him, psychic energy doesn't arise from blind effort. It emerges from genuine meaning. In other words, you don't find motivation in order to live a meaningful life. A meaningful life is what awakens motivation. That single shift changes the way you see yourself. Think about how many times you forced yourself to stay on a path that, deep down, no longer made sense. You told yourself that you just had to keep pushing, stay strong, and never give up. Maybe you managed to keep going for a few more days or weeks. But something inside you still felt unbearably heavy, as though every small step demanded far more effort than it should. It wasn't simply a lack of enthusiasm. It was like carrying an invisible weight that no one else could see. Now think about the opposite. Perhaps there's a moment in your life when you became so absorbed in doing something that you completely lost track of time. You didn't have to fight to keep going. You didn't have to convince your mind to stay engaged. The hours simply slipped by. There was curiosity, presence, genuine interest. Jung would describe that as a moment when your psychic energy was flowing toward the self, what he understood to be the organizing center of the personality and the symbol of our psychological wholeness. When we move toward that center, life stops feeling like a constant obligation. Not because our problems disappear, but because there's harmony between who we are and what we do. That's exactly why so many people mistake exhaustion for laziness. They keep trying to produce results without realizing they've lost touch with the very thing that once gave meaning to their efforts. Their body keeps functioning. Their routine continues. Their responsibilities keep piling up. But their soul is no longer participating in the process. And when the soul withdraws, no productivity system can fill that void. You can organize your schedule, set ambitious goals, wake up earlier, and eliminate distractions. All of those things may improve your efficiency for a while. But efficiency can never replace meaning. And a highly efficient life without purpose is still an emotionally exhausting life. Jung once said, "Who looks outside, dreams, who looks inside, awakens." That insight has never been more relevant than it is today. We live in a time when almost every answer is sought somewhere outside ourselves. People believe they need to find the perfect job, the ideal relationship, the right opportunity, or the next major achievement in order to recover their motivation. But perhaps the most important question was never, "What's missing from my life?" Perhaps it has always been, "What part of myself did I leave behind while trying to build this life?" Notice how that changes everything. Maybe you're not exhausted because you work too much. Maybe you're exhausted because you spend your entire day pursuing goals that belong to your persona, while your self waits quietly to be heard. Perhaps the career you chose was built on expectations that were never truly your own. Perhaps you've learned to measure your worth by the recognition of others. Perhaps you've tied your happiness to the next achievement, the next compliment, the next milestone. And without even realizing it, you've turned your life into an endless series of goals that never quite managed to fill the emptiness within. There's a reason why some achievements bring only a few days of happiness before everything returns to the way it was. The psyche isn't nourished by accomplishments alone. It is nourished by authenticity. The greater the gap between what you achieve and what genuinely resonates with who you are, the weaker your sense of fulfillment will be. That's why some people seem to have everything, yet wake up every morning with no energy to live. Meanwhile, others face enormous hardships but carry within themselves a strength that's difficult to explain. The difference rarely lies in external circumstances. It lies in the connection to one's own sense of meaning. Perhaps, at this very moment, you're beginning to realize that you were never just fighting procrastination or a lack of discipline. Perhaps the real battle has always been taking place somewhere much quieter, between the life you've built and the life your psyche has been trying to reveal all along. And there comes a specific moment when that conflict can no longer be ignored. A moment when the unconscious all but forces you to look inward, even if, at first, it feels uncomfortable, confusing, and even frightening. If this reflection stirred something within you, write the word "meaning" in the comments. Sometimes a single word is enough to mark the moment you stop searching for answers only in the outside world and finally begin turning your attention toward what has been patiently waiting within you all along. There comes a point in the journey of self-discovery when everything begins to make sense. Not because your problems suddenly disappear, but because you finally realize you've been asking the wrong question all along. Perhaps you've spent years trying to figure out how to regain your motivation, when the question you truly needed to ask was a different one: who was the person who lost touch with themselves? That shift may seem subtle, but it completely transforms the way you see your life. Because if motivation depends on harmony between the conscious and the unconscious, then it could never be restored through techniques, discipline, or willpower alone. Before you can recover your energy, you first have to recover your identity. Carl Jung called this process individuation. To him, it wasn't merely a psychological concept, it was the central task of human life. Individuation means no longer living solely as the person the world expects you to be, but gradually becoming the person you truly are. That doesn't happen overnight. And it certainly isn't comfortable. In fact, it's often one of the most confusing periods of life. Because everything that once felt solid begins to be questioned. Old goals lose their appeal. Long-held ambitions no longer seem meaningful. People who once felt indispensable begin drifting away. And during this process, it's common to believe that something has gone terribly wrong. But what if, for the first time, something is finally going right? Think about how many people spend decades pursuing goals they never truly chose for themselves. They work to maintain an image. They stay in relationships because they're afraid of being alone. They remain in careers that drain their energy simply because they've already invested too much time to walk away. The mind creates endless justifications for staying the course. The ego resists change. But the unconscious does not negotiate with what is no longer true. That's why so many crises emerge precisely when, on the surface, everything seems to be working. Your career is stable. Your life appears well organized. People admire you. And yet, there's an emptiness that's almost impossible to explain. Jung understood this moment not as failure, but as a call from the psyche itself. There's one of his quotes that captures this transformation beautifully. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Notice that he didn't say the privilege of life is achieving everything you want, earning everyone's admiration, or proving your worth to the world. He spoke about becoming. That means true fulfillment isn't found only in the destination, but in the ongoing process of integrating every part of your personality. And it is precisely at that point that many people begin to recover an energy they believed they had lost forever. Because motivation doesn't return when you force your mind. It returns when you stop wasting your energy trying to sustain a version of yourself that can no longer exist. Imagine a tree trying to grow while its roots remain trapped in soil that no longer provides nourishment. It doesn't matter how much you water the branches. The real problem is still at the roots. In the same way, there's no point trying to motivate an identity that was built solely to please other people. You have to strengthen what exists in the deepest part of your psyche, where the self resides, the center of psychological wholeness as described by Jung. Perhaps this is exactly the season of life you're in right now. Perhaps the lack of motivation that frightens you so much is actually a sign that your old identity has reached its limit. That would explain why so many things that once worked no longer do. You are no longer exactly the same person. Your conscious mind has begun to recognize aspects of reality that once went unnoticed. Your unconscious has begun demanding greater authenticity and inner coherence. And once consciousness awakens, it becomes increasingly difficult to return to living on autopilot. This awakening, however, brings with it an unavoidable challenge. If you truly decide to listen to that forgotten part of yourself, some choices will have to be reconsidered. Some beliefs will have to die. Some masks will have to fall. And this is precisely where the greatest fear of all emerges, the fear of discovering that the life you've built up to this point may never have truly reflected who you are. Few people have the courage to walk through this stage, because it requires giving up psychological security in exchange for authenticity. Yet there's something even more dangerous than facing this transformation, spending the rest of your life ignoring that quiet inner calling while the unconscious continues sending stronger and stronger signals, waiting for the moment you're finally ready to understand what they truly mean. If this message has touched something real within you, write the phrase, "I choose to be who I truly am," in the comments. Not as a promise to anyone else, but as a quiet commitment to yourself, to the person who may have been waiting for years to finally be acknowledged. If you've made it this far, you've probably realized that the question that opened this video was never really about motivation. It was about identity. About the distance between the life you're living and the person who exists within you. And there's something profoundly liberating that happens when this realization finally sinks in. For a long time, you may have believed that there was something broken inside you that needed fixing. Perhaps you've called yourself lazy, weak, disorganized, or incapable. Perhaps you've looked at people who seem naturally motivated and thought they possessed a strength you simply never had. But through the lens of Carl Jung's psychology, a very different possibility emerges. Perhaps you were never an unmotivated person. Perhaps you were simply someone trying to survive while disconnected from your own center. That realization completely changes the way you face the future. Instead of asking, "How can I force myself to be more productive?" you begin asking, "What is my psyche trying to show me?" Instead of fighting every uncomfortable emotion, you begin to see those emotions as messages. Emptiness is no longer just an enemy. Anxiety is no longer just a flaw. Even the feeling of being stuck can take on a new meaning. Not because suffering is desirable, but because it may be pointing to a transformation that's waiting to happen. Jung said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." This may be one of the hardest truths to accept on the journey of self-discovery. We all wish change could happen quickly, without crises, without doubt, without having to face the parts of ourselves we've hidden for so long. But the psyche doesn't grow by ignoring the shadow. It matures when we have the courage to face it without running away. And ironically, it is in that encounter with what we've avoided the most that an entirely different kind of energy begins to emerge, an energy that's not driven by pressure or comparison. It is an energy born from inner alignment. Think for a moment about how many of your life's decisions have been made out of fear. Fear of disappointing someone. Fear of failure. Fear of rejection. Fear of not living up to expectations. These fears build an invisible prison. What's most dangerous is that, over time, we become so accustomed to living inside it that we start calling it reality. But every psychological prison depends on one condition to survive. That you never notice the bars. Perhaps that's exactly what this video has done. Not to give you ready-made answers, but to show you that some of the limitations that once seemed permanent may have been built from beliefs, masks, and unconscious patterns that no longer have to control your life. This doesn't mean you'll wake up tomorrow overflowing with energy every single day. The journey Jung described never promised a life without conflict. Quite the opposite. It offers something far more genuine. A life in which your conflicts are no longer battles against yourself. When the conscious and the unconscious begin moving in the same direction, the energy once wasted maintaining an artificial identity is finally freed to nourish what truly matters. That's when motivation stops being a rare reward and becomes the natural consequence of living a more authentic life. You may still have doubts. You may still not know exactly which path to take. And that's okay. Jung himself believed that no one discovers their true direction all at once. It unfolds one step at a time, as each person moves closer to the self and learns to recognize the language of the unconscious. The important thing isn't having all the answers right now. It's stopping yourself from running away from the right questions. Because every time you choose to listen to the truest part of yourself, a little of your energy returns. Not because someone gave your motivation back, but because you've stopped wasting it fighting against your own nature. Perhaps the next time that familiar discouragement appears, instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" you'll ask a far more powerful question. What part of me is trying to be heard right now? That single shift has the power to completely transform your relationship with self-discovery, depth psychology, and the way you understand your own story. After all, as Jung showed throughout his life's work, what seems like the end of one version of ourselves is often nothing more than the quiet beginning of the person we were always meant to become. If this reflection resonated with you, write the phrase, "Today I choose to awaken," in the comments. I hope those words become a milestone in your journey, not because your life will change overnight, but because this may be the moment you decided to stop searching for your strength only in the outside world and finally begin finding it within yourself. If you've stayed with me until this point, there's a good chance this wasn't just another video you'll watch and forget. Perhaps it touched something you rarely put into words. A feeling that, somehow, you've been trying to understand your own mind for a very long time, but you've been looking in all the wrong places. And if that's what happened, it isn't a coincidence. If this message resonated with you, if at any point you recognized yourself in these reflections on motivation, identity, the persona, the shadow, and the inner conflict described by Carl Jung, then consider subscribing to the channel. The purpose here isn't to offer easy answers. It's to explore exactly this kind of deeper understanding of the human mind, the unconscious, and the patterns that quietly shape our lives. And if something inside you was stirred today, this is probably just the beginning of a much greater journey of self-discovery. Now I'd love to hear from you. Tell me honestly in the comments. Did this message reflect something you felt, or perhaps are feeling right now? Write whatever came to mind as you watched. There are no right or wrong answers here. Only your experience. Sometimes, putting those feelings into words is already an important step towards seeing more clearly what once felt like an emptiness you couldn't explain. If this video helped you see your motivation in a new light, leave a like. It helps this message reach other people who may be going through the very same inner conflict, believing they've lost something, when in reality they're moving through a much deeper process of transformation. And if you know someone who's been feeling discouraged, confused, or disconnected from themselves, share this video with them. Sometimes, a single message at the right moment can completely change the way someone understands their own life. And before you go, I highly recommend watching the next video that's now appearing on your screen. It explores even further the idea that many of our emotional struggles are not signs of weakness, but evidence of a much deeper inner process quietly unfolding within the psyche. It may be exactly the continuation you need to help all of these ideas come together in a whole new way. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. I'll see you in the next video.